American History 2 and World Civilizations 2. Once again, you should all be viewing the same video since we're all getting into the Cold War as a group over the next few weeks. So, as I mentioned for all of you in the last video you watched, both American History 2 and World Civilizations, we are going to be spending the next few weeks talking about the Cold War. To start things off, we're going to focus on the Cold War really at the big picture of the conflict between America and the Soviet Union. Because as I'm sure most of you know, to simplify it, the Cold War was a competition or a sort of quasi-conflict between America and the Soviet Union. So, like I said, today we'll focus on the big picture of that, and over the next few weeks we'll look at some of the smaller conflicts which resulted from the Cold War. But anyway, as always, of course, we're going to look at some upcoming dates. I think I got our upcoming dates and our key terms actually switched around in this PowerPoint, but I think that should be okay. We'll get there eventually anyway. So, all of you should have heard me give the spiel about the upcoming assignments already in the last video, so I won't spend much time on them this time, but just keep in mind that these assignments do exist, and they need to be turned in at the due date. If that is a problem, you please let me know beforehand, and don't try to email me right before or right after an assignment due date. But anyway, in the meantime, like I said, we will go into the key terms. Today, we're going to get more specific into what the nuclear arms race was. We're going to look at something called 2 minutes to midnight. We're going to look at the space race, and we'll look at Sputnik 1 and Apollo 11, two, of course, very important parts of the space race. Now, to get into a little bit about what the Cold War was like between America and the Soviet Union, you have to understand the stalemate that existed between the two countries. Now, in regards to public opinion about the conflict of the Cold War after World War II, historians have stated the following. Most people of the world would have felt safe if the United States alone had owned this weapon that was so superior to all other weapons. Now, why do you think this is the case? Why might the world theoretically have been safer if only the United States had these weapons? And to give you a bit of a hint, what did we talk about last time that explained why the Cold War as a whole never became hot? Awkward pause once again. But yes, very good, students. This is the idea that if only the United States had had these weapons, there would have never been any nuclear arms race. The United States alone would have been the world's undisputed superpower, and no one would ever really have felt the courage to ever have any sort of conflict again, because there would always be the threat of the United States dropping an atomic bomb on you. Of course, many of us could argue that that would just lead to totalitarianism and some sort of world dictatorship, but that's a bit of another perspective. The idea is that as soon as the Soviet Union got access to nuclear weapons, there was a guarantee that the threat of nuclear warfare was always going to be there. Because of this, there was, of course, a nuclear arms race between the United States and the Soviet Union. The nuclear arms race is reported to have begun on August 29th, 1949, when the Soviet Union had its first successful nuclear weapons test, also known as the code name RDS-1, in modern-day Kazakhstan. This was detected by the United States very quickly and was announced by President Truman to the United States and the world by September 23rd, 1949. In this speech, he said the following. We have evidence that within recent weeks, an atomic explosion occurred in the USSR. The eventual development of this new force by other nations was to be expected. This probability has always been taken into account by us. Now, what exactly do you think he is trying to accomplish with this announcement? Awkward pause once again. But yes, as you can probably see pretty clearly from this quote, he's essentially trying to downplay the severity of the event and try to hold off any panic. Instead of saying, this is totally unexpected by us, we have no clue what's happening, this is horrible, he says, hey guys, don't worry, we always knew this was going to happen. We already took this into account even. We're totally prepared for this. So it's trying to convince people that this isn't actually that big of a deal, and the United States is still prepared to beat the Soviet Union in this arms race. Now, this nuclear arms race might be a bit self-explanatory, but just to clearly define it, this was the competition between the Soviets and America to develop the most and most deadly nuclear stockpiles. which led to this nuclear stalemate you can see here depicted in this political cartoon. So essentially, why did the nuclear arms race make the Cold War a Cold War? Let me move my face out of the way, that might help. But yeah, look at the signs right here. On no account to be used because the enemy might retaliate. And so you see here soldiers fighting each other with bows and arrows, pretty primitive weapons, most people would argue, but it's essentially symbolic of how these wars had to be fought. Because of this nuclear arms race, again, since the United States didn't have all of them, no one was actually willing to use these bombs because they knew that the enemy could retaliate. So therefore, wars were fought on a much smaller scale than nuclear warfare would be capable of, and so that's why we have these smaller conflicts we're going to talk about over the next few weeks, instead of nuclear bombs being launched at people. Now, this eventually, a good example of how deadly and potentially deadly the nuclear arms race became is from a term called the 2 minutes to midnight. This, of course, is a famous Iron Maiden song, which some of you have hopefully heard of, but it's actually based on a real event. This is based on a particular period of the nuclear arms race, which occurred between 1952 and 1953. On August of 1952, America tested their first thermonuclear bomb over the Pacific Ocean as part of Operation Ivy. A thermonuclear bomb, just to give you an idea, is a hydrogen-based bomb, which created an even more powerful explosion through nuclear fusion than the atomic bombs in Japan were capable of. By August of 1953, about a year later, the USSR had tested their first hydrogen bomb in central Siberia. This, of course, demonstrates that both countries now have access to even more powerful nuclear weapons than they had before. Because of this, the Doomsday Clock in 1953 was moved up to 2 minutes to midnight. The Doomsday Clock, for any of you who don't know, is a symbol which traces the likelihood of a global man-made catastrophe. The closer it gets to midnight, the more likely it theoretically is that a doomsday event is going to happen. This was actually the closest the clock has ever been to midnight, or it was the closest the clock had ever been to midnight. It was tied in 2018, but was actually surpassed in early 2020 of this year, even before the coronavirus, if you can believe it. Feels like forever ago, which at that point was moved to 100 seconds to midnight. So again, for any of you who are aware, try to look up what event actually pushed that clock to 100 seconds to midnight. It's hard to remember at this point since this year has been going on for about 40 years. This led, of course, eventually to one of my favorite songs of all time, 2 Minutes to Midnight by Iron Maiden and their album Power Slave, which was a song intended to protest the nuclear arms race and the resulting potential doomsday. Keep this in mind as well, these idea of counterculture or protest songs. They're going to be a big topic that we're going to continue to discuss as we move into things like the counterculture and essentially reactions to this nuclear arms race. But anyway, in the meantime, we'll look at how the Cold War actually was directly competed between the United States and the Soviet Union, since they couldn't nuke each other. There have been 3 major ways that this occurred. One we'll talk about today is the space race. The second is what we're going to spend most of the rest of the class really discussing, which are the international influence and third world conflicts that occurred between countries allied to the Soviet Union and countries allied to the United States. Which, by the way, I can almost guarantee that most of you don't actually know what the third world means, which was actually a term coined during the Cold War. Most of you probably think that the first world means developed and rich nations, the second world means developing nations that are getting richer, and the third world means poor, impoverished nations. On a simplified term, you could argue that is actually what it does kind of mean, but officially, the first world would be these countries in blue, countries that are allied with the United States and capitalism. The second world are these countries in red, countries that are allied with the Soviet Union and communism. The third world are these countries in green. They're countries that aren't officially allied with either side, so both groups are going to try to exert their influence upon them. This led to a lot of the sort of proxy wars or indirect wars between the United States and the Soviet Union. That's how a lot of these Cold War conflicts were actually played out, and they're what we'll spend most of the rest of the semester talking about. We'll also conclude class today talking about the economic competition between capitalism and communism. Now, to get into the space race, Why do you think, for example, the US and the USSR cared so much about the space race? What's so important about trying to get into space? Hope someone appreciates this meme, by the way. Now, there were a few military applications which is important to recognize. For example, Sputnik, which we're getting ready to talk about, was launched by a Soviet intercontinental ballistic missile. For those of you who don't know what that is, an intercontinental ballistic missile is a missile that's capable of carrying any sort of explosive or nuclear weapon across continents. Obviously, if you get a missile like that to work, very devastating potentials to be used in nuclear warfare. However, this was also seen as an attempt to show the superiority of the respective political and economic systems in the United States and the Soviet Union. If the United States could win the space race, it made democracy and capitalism look fantastic. If the Soviet Union won, it made totalitarianism and communism seem fantastic. So, because of this, the space race was quite an extensive and hotly competed event. Early timeline actually didn't look so well for the United States. Just to give you a very brief overview. Late 1957, the USSR launches Sputnik 1. This is the first Earth-orbiting satellite in history, artificial satellite at least. So the Soviet Union literally did beat us into space. By next month, they had also launched Sputnik 2 and a dog named Laika, if I'm pronouncing that correctly, which was the first living organism in orbit. And by 1958, the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, NASA, had been created to compete with the Soviets. Later that year, in 1958, the United States launched SCORD, a communications satellite which launched the first broadcast ever given from space. Pretty noteworthy event, I think you could argue, which was actually a Christmas message from then-President Dwight D. Eisenhower. By 1959, the USSR had launched Luna 2, which was the first spacecraft to ever reach the moon. By 1960, the USSR had launched Sputnik 5, which contained the first animals and plants to ever return alive after being launched into space. The animals, by the way, were 2 dogs. By 1961, the U.S. finally had its first animal return alive from space, Ham, a chimpanzee. By April 12, 1961, as you can see pictured here, the USSR had sent Yuri Gagarin, if I'm pronouncing that correctly, in orbit around Earth, who was the first human to actually ever reach space. Now, obviously, who does it look like here is actually winning the space race? Yeah, I won't give you a very long pause for that, because that one probably seems pretty obvious. It would seem that the USSR is winning the space race here. However, why does the US typically get credit for winning the space race? What did we do that gave us the sort of unofficial victory? Now, that's probably pretty obvious. America did bounce back primarily because of the moon landing. On July 14th, 1965, just to give you a bit of a foreshadowing, the U.S. satellite Mariner 4 did actually perform the first ever successful voyage to Mars and brought the first close-up images of the Martian surface, which you can see depicted in this photograph right here. Finally, by December 21st of 1968, Apollo 8 had carried the first person to the moon and was the first to orbit the moon and return. Finally, and infamously, by July 20th, 1969, Neil Armstrong and Edwin Buzz Aldrin became the first men to walk on the moon. Interestingly, TV technology had also progressed to the point that this landing was broadcast to about 723 million people once it happened. So, why is it so important that TV was around to capture this moment? Very good. Yes, future class. This is essentially a great propaganda moment for the United States. Not only did this extraordinary event happen, due to the increased TV technology, it was able to be captured so that many people around the world could instantly gain access to it and know that this had happened. The fact that this is also widely recorded and distributed is one of the reasons the United States has gained credit for winning the space race. It was essentially a huge worldwide media event. Now, to wrap things up, we will look a little bit at the overall competition between capitalism and communism. This competition was summarized in October of 1961 by Nikita Khrushchev, if I'm pronouncing that correctly, who was a Soviet premier, president/dictator at the time. He announced that in 20 years, by 1981, the Soviet Union would have a better standard of living than any capitalist country, and that its industry would double the entire non-socialist world. Now, why do you think he would make this claim? And essentially, what are they both groups trying to accomplish with this competition? Oh yeah, I already basically summed this one up for you. He's essentially trying to prove the superiority of the communist Soviet system over the Western world. It's also essentially a recruiting tactic. If he can convince various third world nations that the Soviet Union's economy is going to be great, he can convince other people them to ally with the Soviet Union over the Americans. So again, what they're trying to accomplish internationally is advertise themselves to the rest of the world. By 1999, however, a CIA report had been released that found that the Soviet economy was actually underperforming the United States after the 1970s, especially in a few key areas. For example, healthcare had few professionals, few supplies, and poor funding. Housing had poor maintenance and a cramped living space. Consumer goods were of poor quality and there was a low variety. Food supplies could not match the growing demand that the Soviet Union had, despite the fact that they had 8% more workers than the United States and 40% more cultivated land than the United States. Finally, manufacturing electronics was behind the rest of the Western world, largely due to a lack of access to materials. Now, although Ron Swanson, of course, here is summarizing it very simply, the historians and economists have identified three key reasons why the Soviet Union's economy underperformed at this time. First, there was a lack of reliable price signals. For those of you who don't know what price signals are essentially sort of indications in the media, in economic journals, whatever it might be, or just in any sort of business communication that indicates how prices are going to change or what sort of product is going to become more popular. For example, in American media, we of course have plenty of commercials, which can give an indication of what kind of product is going to be popular. Since the Soviet Union media was so restricted, there were not really many price signals to indicate how prices and how products are going to change in the economy, so no one really had any way to anticipate what sort of product was going to be popular or what sort of product needed to be produced that you could sell for a lot of money. Also, there was a lack of consumer influence on producers. Since the government had so much control over the economy, consumers really had no way to influence the producers to get the products and the sort of quality they wanted, so a lot of producers weren't really inspired to produce high-quality products. And finally, there was a lack of substantial competition. This especially led to the poor quality and low variety of goods consumers had access to. As many of you capitalist fans or just general economy fans might be aware of, one of the staples of capitalism is the idea that if markets are allowed to compete against each other, they'll have lower prices and be inspired to produce a higher variety and more high-quality products. Since there was not much competition because of governmental control, it's argued that the industries in the Soviet Union were not inspired to have much variety. So again, just remember, keep thinking for the future why these things are so important to a successful economy, arguably, and think about how well we're doing with these things today. For any of you who ever watch the news, how to run a successful economy is obviously still hotly debated in many places today. And as some of you know, especially in my American history class, who watched how I talked about the robber barons and American industry, my feelings on this can actually be quite mixed. So again, I'm not attacking either economic side in this instance necessarily, but the Soviet Union does represent a very extreme case of communist control. Now, that's about all I have for you this time. Hopefully you'll all enjoy the rest of your week as much as possible. If we haven't already had our debate, I look forward to that as well. And just good luck with everything you're engaging in at this time. Being a little bit unnecessarily awkward, I apologize. But just have a great rest of your day. Thank you.